About a month ago, I had the privilege of interviewing Robert Yeo together with my guest interviewer, Daryl Lim, who used to be a mentee of Robert's. For those of you who do not know who Robert is, he is a veteran Singaporean writer who has written in a wide range of genres including poetry, fiction, and drama. He has a wealth of experience and insight, both of which he so generously shared with us during our conversation. In fact, I'm still in awe at the number of names which he listed in the 1-hour conversation. Beyond that, I was also gripped by his analytical and historical discussion of Singapore poetry and drama, anecdotes from his life and career, and carefully considered opinions on topics like experimental poetry and today's culture of criticism, or lack thereof. While the conversation was anchored in history, it also had its eye on the present and the future, which, for me, is an admirable attitude that characterizes Robert and his generation. Well, without further ado, in conversation with Robert Yeo. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Sploosh. So today we are with Robert Yeo, a veteran poet, prose writer, playwright, etc.
Yes.
And with me is Daryl Lim.
Hello, hi everyone. Daryl here.
So sort of an intergenerational recording today.
Yeah, for Sploosh, I think many of the writers that have been interviewed, including myself, are relatively youthful. So this was, I thought, a good opportunity to I think go back a little bit into how, in some ways, Singapore poetry in English and Singapore literature in English started off in Singapore. So yeah, pleased to have you with us here today, Robert. And I should also say that Robert is a good friend of mine and has been for a very long time, because Robert was my mentor under the NAC's Mentor Access program a long time back. And I always enjoyed those afternoons in Robert's place, because we would just talk about everything and anything under the sun related to poetry and the history of Singapore literature.
I guess talking about anything under the sun, we should just start simple.
Yes.
How have you been?
Yes. I'm about to publish my latest book called Roots 2, which is a continuation of Roots 1940 to 1975, a Singaporean memoir which I published in 2011. And it took me some time before I started on Roots 2, which covers the period 1976 to year 2000. And then I will end there. I feel it is an indulgent book, but I just felt that sometimes it's fine to go against conventional wisdom and write a long book rather than what is the advice given now to write short things.
Yes.
So this book is about 216 pages and is going to be published. And if you ask me how I am, I'll say I'm looking forward to it being published and read, I guess, and then I'm not going to continue beyond year 2000. Because after the year 2000, in 2002, I retired. And what is there to write about? I mean, what is there to write about when you have retired, So, yes, I hope that answers your question as to how I am.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the book since we're here, in terms of what it broadly covers. Maybe the highlights.
Let me ask you this question. I'm 83 this year, and I figure that if you divide my life into two chunks of 35 years each, I figure the first 35 years is probably, speaking about myself, more interesting than the next 35 years. I mean, when you are younger, you're more adventurous. You do things that as a slightly older person you're not likely to do. I mean, in the year 1970, or was it 71, when I took up a job in Bangkok, I actually did not fly to Bangkok. I drove to Bangkok in a car, picked up a co-driver in Kuala Lumpur, and just took off. And it took us about a week to get to Bangkok. These are not things that I will do or could do presently. So that's why I figured that, as I say, that I think the first 35 years of my life is more interesting than the next 35.
So what's your motivation in writing a personal memoir? Is it just to relive your life once more?
No, the immediate motivation, Hao Yang and Daryl, was a story that my grand auntie told me about 4 Yeo brothers, one of whom is my paternal grandfather, about how they came from Sarawak. That's my origins. And one of the brothers agreed to marry a local girl. But guess what? On the wedding day, he failed to show up. And the native girl's family was naturally very furious and put a bomo to harass the 4 Yeo brothers, forcing them to flee upon pain of their lives, to flee Sarawak, and they landed up in Singapore. And my maternal grandfather stayed in Singapore, and his 3 brothers went to Malaysia. So I thought, wow, what a wonderful story, you know. And I said, well, I'm going to write my own story. I'm going to call it Roots. But I'm not going to spell it R-O-O-T-S, because the title had already been taken by an African American who had written a famous book called Roots, R-O-O-T-S. And so I decided I would call my book Roots. Different spelling, but same sound. So that was the immediate motivation. So I said, okay, I'm going to write my memoirs. I've never written in that particular genre. So give it a try.
Maybe just last question on this. Did you discover something about yourself or the way you write in the course of writing the latest book?
I discovered that I was very particular about dates. What incident, what happened, whom did I meet, on what day, what year, what time. I became quite obsessed about memory, knowing that memory is selective. That some things you forget and some things you remember. And that's why the book had a lot of footnotes. I also thought that I had found a new way of writing autobiography, which is to say that you just don't write a story from A to Z, but you have a structure. And this structure I would call the ripple effect. That is to say, you start by writing about self, then you ripple out to community, then you ripple out to country, and you ripple out to the rest of the world. So I was writing about myself, but all the time making connections in episodes and stories I tell using the ripple effect.
And actually at this point, I'm reminded of, I think, a collection of poetry published back in, was it the 70s? Because I remember reading in an anthology, and the poems in that collection were just based in like different parts of, I think, the region which you traveled to. Like, there were a lot written in Vietnam, I remember. Right?
Yes.
Do you remember that?
This is and napalm does not help, right?
That's right.
Yeah, that's what. Yes.
Yeah. So I feel like your concern for, like, not just yourself, but also your community and also the region and going on different routes has been, I think, a defining trait of your writing. And that has kind of logically ended up in the memoir you've written, and which is titled Roots.
Yeah, I figured so. I was very concerned about the Vietnam War. I didn't believe in it. Let me put it this way. I read about the domino theory of how if North Vietnam conquered South Vietnam, the rest of Southeast Asia would fall. So I was very concerned about the domino effect that communism was going to take over Southeast Asia, Singapore included, So I felt that when the job opportunity was offered for me to work in Thailand, I thought, well, I would go to a country that's not Vietnam, but close enough to Vietnam. I said to myself, that is the closest that I'm going to get to the Vietnam War. And I took a position as an information officer because I knew that I would be able to travel. So I did spend a week in Saigon, what is now known as Ho Chi Minh City, and tried to imbibe the atmosphere of being in Saigon during the Vietnam War. I must say that I was the only person, apart from Go Posing, who wrote about the Vietnam War. No other Singapore writer in English was preoccupied or was concerned about the Vietnam War or wrote about it. I think I'm right about that, but do check it out.
Like, I remember we had a question for later section about contemporary writing and the development of Singapore literature, right? And I think what I am perhaps observing is that writers of the past they wrote more about things that concerned the community, like about historical events, for example. And whereas with the rise of like confessionalism, I think there's been a turn inwards, and more poets are writing about themselves and not about historical events or social events. And I think we could discuss that later, but I'm just putting this out there as like a sort of observation on my part. Yeah.
Would you say that that's true, Daryl, of poets of your generation being inward-looking and confessional and that sort of thing?
I'm not. Yeah. I think what's definitely true is that I think in your time, in the 70s and 60s, there was at least a greater sense of the post-colonial era. And in some ways, I think solidarity with both the post-colonial states and also with our regional neighbors. So I think the writers of that time, including yourself, and I would include Thambu as well, had a greater sense of this worldwide community of writers, including the situation in Southeast Asia and also in post-colonial Africa, Southeast Asia, and all these states. I think that sense of that solidarity has eroded a bit over the years. So that's my own sense of it.
Yes. Edwin Thambu did write about post-colonial societies and about Africa, because I think he did go to Africa several times for conferences. And also, of course, his doctoral thesis was on African writing. So I think also the other thing that my generation was preoccupied with was independence politics and regional politics. Although we didn't write about the founding of ASEAN, you know what I mean. I was always aware, having been fortunate enough to have lived in Thailand, becoming aware of ancient kingdoms like Sukhothai and Ayutthaya, you know, that Southeast Asia has a rich political and cultural history, you know. And in fact, one of the reasons why I took up the job in Bangkok was actually to decolonize myself, in the sense that I had been fortunate enough to have studied in Europe in the 60s, and having studied English literature and English history, it seemed to me that I knew more about England and Europe than I did about Singapore and Southeast Asia.
Before we talk about Singapore literature and history of literature as well, we could just begin with a smaller piece, which is personal history, right? So I think this is a relevant question for me because I'm also kind of thinking about getting into the art scene as well. So like in the past, why did you choose to get into writing if the arts were seen as a luxury we could not afford?
Well, I was about to say when I was making notes to prepare to answer your questions, when you say I got into the art scenes as a writer, never was a professional writer. I was an amateur writer. In other words, I was earning a living and writing at the same time. So I wrote out of interest, and because I thought I was living through interesting times. I mean, I went to school in the 40s when it was pretty colonial, and then I went to a Christian school, St. Andrew's School, became familiar with Christianity, and then there was the fight for independence. Our history as part of Malaysia, the story that we got kicked out of Malaysia, which actually isn't true, because our leaving Malaysia was very carefully negotiated, and so on and so forth. So I felt that I was living through interesting times and just went on writing. And I was fortunate enough that I liked my job. The job did not cause me stress. And I was able to go on to do, I would say, an awful lot of writing. Most of my major writings were done when I was in teacher training institutions, first of all,
If you go back, when did the first thought of even wanting to write and to express yourself creatively come?
I guess it goes back to school. And the interesting thing was, I guess I was lucky. When I was in secondary 3 or secondary 4, and I was about 14, 15 or 16, I took a subject called additional literature. And included in the curriculum were the Augustan poets and the Romantic poets. So I was exposed to Romantic poetry quite early in my life. I finished my O level in 56. So I was exposed to Romantic poetry when I was 16, during an impressionable age. And I sort of felt, well, I would like to be able to write like Blake or Wordsworth. So that was the impulse. And become famous, I suppose, and be mentioned in books and so on and so forth. A kind of youthful impulse. You know what I mean? The other influence on my writing was, of course, I picked up a pocket edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. And that also was influential in the sense, like I said, well, I like to be able to write like that, you know. And one of the messages of the Rubaiyat is live for the moment. Enjoy yourself.
And then when was your first ever published work? Your first ever published creative work? Because you would have published something before the book, right?
I had published in journals. I think I had published in Poetry Singapore, edited by Edwin Tambo, Temasek, edited by Gopo Singh. And in 1971, my first book of poems, my first book ever appeared. I received the book when I was in Bangkok in 1971. But I had deposited the manuscript with Federal Publications. I had no chance to proofread the book, so there were typos and so on and so forth. And I got a very bad review. It was not a very good moment to publish your first book and to be wrapped quite seriously, by a NUS academic. But I knew she was wrong about me, and I didn't allow it to affect my desire to write poetry. And I continued. I think I was helped by the success in 1974 of my first play called Are You There, Singapore? Because it played to packed houses. And there is a story behind that particular play, because I had written it back in 68. And I showed it around, and nobody was interested in Singapore play or play by a Singaporean. So I forgot all about it, but lucky I left a copy with someone called G.G. Thompson, who was the Deputy Director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then I went to Bangkok and worked there for 2 years, completely forgetting that I had written this play until I came back. I contacted G.G. Thompson again, and we met for lunch in a cricket club. And then a few days later, he said he was cleaning his house and he found a manuscript of my play. I think I must have sent it to his son, Alexander Thompson, who had expressed interest in meeting me. So if that had not happened, I wouldn't have had a drama career, a dramatic career, if you like.
If you look at these two things, right, in some ways, both your work in poetry and in the theatre kind of developed in parallel.
Yes.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit more about what led you to write each piece? So what led you to write Coming Home Baby, and what led you to write Are You There, Singapore?
Coming Home Baby was the result of what I had written in the decade of the 60s. And it's quite an interesting story that I told in Roots, that when I submitted the manuscript, one of the editors of Federal Publications was actually Wong May. Yeah. She looked at my manuscript and she gave me this advice. She said, I noticed that your poems include some early poems which we will describe, which is described usually as juvenilia. I think you should take them out because juvenilia is of interest only to critics. If you will become very famous, they will study your juvenilia. So why don't you just publish the poems that are good, that are realized? And I thought that was pretty good advice. And I took the advice, and the result is coming home maybe minus the juvenilia. But what I didn't know about Wang Mei then was I knew the Wang Mei who had published in 7 Poets, but I didn't know that she had already by that time published a Bad Girl's Book of Animals.
So you hadn't read that?
She had published it already.
But you had not read?
I don't read, didn't even know, but she didn't reveal it. The Wang Mei I knew was the Wang Mei whose poems appeared in 7 Poets, edited by Tambo. I cannot remember the date.
So what about your play?
The play was accidental, as I told you.
But how did you come to write
Well,
it?
the impetus for writing plays, I think, comes from having been a student in London and 66 to 68, having to create a new nation and talking to Singapore students who were there with me, Malaysian students and students abroad who have gone through the same period of decolonization. When I came back to Singapore, what I heard in my ears was animated talk. Dangerous talk even about new nations, decolonization, the freedom to write on anything you want to write about, and so on and so forth. So I said, this sort of things cannot go into poems. It ought to get into a play. And before I knew it, I was already writing a play, which I think I finished in fairly quickly. Then I showed it to a friend called Katie Joseph, who was interested in the Singaporean play. And he helped me edit it and improve upon it. Then I was ready to take it to a Singaporean director. This was late 68, 69, 70. But no Singaporean director was interested. I left for Bangkok. I forgot that I had written a play. Completely.
You mentioned earlier that you felt the subject matter was more suitable for a play than a poem, right? And I think something quite remarkable is that you've written, poetry, prose, drama, and libretti for opera. So how do you decide which form to write?
Sometimes it's luck. When I wrote the libretto for Fences, it was commissioned. Liao Xiakfa, the founder of lyric opera and the man who, to my mind, introduced Western opera into Singapore arts. And opera, not just Western opera, but opera because there are now Singaporeans who write operas. He got John Shapley, the composer, and I together and said, I have a story for you. Can you both together write this opera provided you like the story? And the story he gave me was a kind of Romeo and Juliet story in which a devout but liberal Muslim called Nora, that was the name I gave her subsequently, in Malaya Hall in the 60s, meets a cheeky Singaporean. And this was the period after separation, before separation and after separation. And he said, what do you think of the subject? And I said, I like the idea because it is about politics. I'm always drawn to politics. And John Shapley said he liked the idea too. Then I asked the crucial question, which comes first, the music or the words? Because I'm musically illiterate. So he said the words come first. So then I said we've got something going together. So I will write the words and pass it to John. And John will take a look at the words, see if he likes it, and write the music from there. So to answer your question, how young, I figured that if I've written plays, I've written poetry, I can write the libretto because really it's the play and lyrics. Lyrics, in this case, they could be an aria or they could be choruses. So I took up the challenge.
We should also maybe talk a little bit about your novel, which is
Oh.
The Adventures of Holden Hing. Maybe tell us a little bit about how that came about.
It's a kind of farewell to being a bachelor, and I think myself that it's a funny novel which I wrote entirely in my head. I was thinking about it, and wherever I go, I was turning the episodes and the words in my head. And the inspiration for that particular novel is a quote from Ambrose Bierce, Bierce, who has written a wonderful dictionary called the Devil's Dictionary. You know that? And he defined a bachelor as a man whom women are still sampling. So that really is what The Adventures of Holden Hing was about. The interesting thing about Holden Hing was that it was launched in the Raffles Hotel.
Wow.
Yeah. How come the Raffles Hotel would welcome a Singaporean writer? You know, their snooty Raffles Hotel. Because the general manager was an Italian who I think single-handedly rescued the Raffles Hotel because at one stage it was in danger of being demolished. Roberto Pregas. I got along very well with him. And I asked him, can I launch your book in the Raffles Hotel? He said, sure. So that's a bit of history there. Launching my only novel in the Raffles Hotel. I've got pictures, and in fact, in Roots too, I tell the story of the launch.
That's a good reason to buy the book. To buy Roots too.
Do you think it's possible in this day and age publish your next book in Raffles Hotel?
No, it's very difficult because I think the same snootiness might still prevail.
No way today. I shouldn't say no way. I like to see somebody try.
Yes,
Why
I think
not?
we should try.
Because our writers are getting to be internationally known, right? You know what I mean? So why not? If they weren't so snooty.
We can move on to poetry now. So my impression of Singlit now is that it is heavily dominated by poetry. I'm not sure how valid that view is, and I don't know if Daryl shares that view. So has it always been this way?
Poetry has always been steadily written over the decades. From the time when Edwin Tambu published Rib of Earth, I think, when was it? In the 50s or 60s?
50s.
And then Wong Pinam came and Yi Tiang Hong came. When I was an undergraduate in the first or second year, Tambu and Tiang Hong were invited by Prof. D.J. Enright, the English poet and head of department, to come and read. So for the first time, those of us who aspired to write were able to meet Singaporean Malaysian writer poets Yi Tiang Hong and Edwin Tambu.
Yeah, that must have been quite the moment, because before that, all the poets had been largely white poets in the textbooks, and
But
they studied.
we didn't know about the Teo brothers.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. I asked Edwin Tambu when he was compiling his anthology, what is it called? Second Time. If he knew about the Teo brothers, he said he didn't know. So actually our modern poetry, if you like, would begin with the Teo brothers. But if you didn't know the Teo brothers, then our modern poetry would begin with Edwin Tambu and Yi Tiang Hong. But the Teo brothers was a surprise, you know.
Do you have a guess as to why a poetry has been such a dominant form in Singapore?
I agree with Edwin Tambu. He said in one forum in the National Museum, the poems we write mostly are short poems, and they are easier to write because they're short. They are answers to the moment, a moment of inspiration. I like to use the word provocation, a moment of provocation. Novels take a long time, plays take a long time. Perhaps the alternative could be the short story. But until recently, when we have this flash fiction, it still took some time to write a short story in answer to a provocation. You know what I mean? Poems, you can just scribble, or you can write a haiku, and later on you can revise it into something longer. You know what I mean? But I think there was a period in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s when plays took over. And I was happy to be involved in that period because I chaired two national committees. One, the Drama Advisory Committee, and then another committee, the Drama Review Committee, until 1991. So I lived through what I would call was an exciting period of theatre. Robin Loon, the NUS academic, has called that period the golden age of Singaporean theatre in English. And through a series of reasons which I will talk about later, the theatre was able to produce a succession of very interesting young playwrights and directors who, over a period of about 20 years, produce one play after another to give us what I think is a canon of plays. I could name the players and their plays, and the fact that they were able to tackle themes which were very exciting. Let me look at my list. During that period, they tackled the following things: questioning the system, the entire system. And the person who did it was Ko Pao Kun in The Coffin is Too Big for the Hole. Singapore politics, that's myself and Tan Tan Hao. Lesbian relationships, Eleanor Wong. Violence against women, Talak by Ellen Govan. Feminism, Ovidia Yu, Woman on a Tree on a Hill. Mental illness, Haresh Sharma in Off Center, which became a school text. Pedophilia, Desmond Sim in a play called Autumn Tom Yam. And questioning housing politics, third stage. So I think it was an interesting period when theatre became professional. You know, there was a terrific buzz about theatre. And you asked me about the work of the Drama Advisory Committee, Hao Yang. The committee advised the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Community Development. And the ministry organized the following activities which made theatre buzz: playwriting competitions, drama festivals. There was 10 years of the drama festival, arts festivals, ASEAN festivals, grants to theatre companies, review of plays submitted for performance, theatre homes, and so on and so forth. It made theatre sort of cool, you know, and theatre was not only cool, but it was live. You could take part. If you an audience, you're not part of the play, you go there and see your friends take part in the play or have behind the scene roles. And I think it produced, to my mind, three figures who are today internationally known in my view. Of course, the late Ko Pao Kun, Ong Keng Sen, and Haresh Sharma. So during that period, theatre was dominant because it was seen to be cool.
Which is kind of surprising because I'd expect, like political repression or like OB markers, all of that to be stronger back then as compared to now. But it seems that theatre was much livelier back then, the theatre scene.
Oh yes, there were incidents, some of which were reported, some of which were not. When my play was passed, 1 year back home was passed for production, for staging in 1980, the person who wrote the letter to me, and I had been corresponding with ministry people, when she wrote to me to say, we have no objection to the staging of 1 year back home, signed so-and-so, controller of undesirable publications. In other words, in the 80s or during that period, plays that talk about politics that mention Lee Siew Cho or Lim Chin Siong were seen as possibly leftist, pro-communist documents. Forum Theatre, I think in 1994, two of the Forum Theatre people, Alvin Tan and Haresh Sharma, attended a workshop in New York. And the Straits Times said that they attended Marxist workshops. And they were practicing a form of theatre called Forum Theatre, in which the audience was encouraged to intervene to propose an ending. they were seen as being under Marxist influence, and foreign theatre was forbidden for a decade. Licenses have been known to be issued 1 or 2 days before performance and things like that. Grants were denied to plays that did not toe the line and so on and so forth. So, yes, it was that period of playwriting when the censor was very active. I don't think poets ever face the censors. Novelists may. I mean, people like Gopal Bharathan can be quite controversial. You know. So there was a period when I think poetry was not dominant. Plays were dominant.
But going back to poetry, I think I sent you a picture of a poem written by Lun Lo called Breath as Cinema from New Small Poetries. And so I just wanted to hear your thoughts on, experimental poetry now as compared to what writers of your age could write back then.
Well, I think in my view, the experimental poet of my generation is Arthur Yap. But I think he used grammar as a theme and then as a strategy, but I think he's not been sufficiently appreciated in my view. People write all kinds of things about him. They talk about his use of Singlish and so on. But I think the most important thing was that he studied in Leeds. And Leeds was the center of linguistics, particularly what is known as generational grammar. And he imbibed it, and he became part of his poetry. So I think he was experimental, but not recognized. Such I have written an essay on him, but which has not been picked up. So I think a lot of, in my view, a lot of things written about Arthur Yap doesn't impress me.
Yeah, I mean the poem that comes to mind when you say that is the poem called Grammar of a Dinner.
Yeah.
Which I think is what you're referring to. And that I think showcases his ability to use some of this linguistics background as a source of experimentalism in his poetry.
You're asking me about Lun Lo.
Yes.
Lun Lo. I tried to read the poems. What I can say is that I've not yet reached the stage when I can appreciate what she is doing. And what she does is quite similar to Marilyn Tan, who won the literature prize, and competing was some late poems of Edwin Tambo, which didn't win. So a lot depends on the judges, I suppose. Is that so? The judges are ready for something new. I'm not yet attuned to the new. I welcome it because it could presage something new that's going to overwhelm us. I don't know. But at the moment, I can't say that I understand it or appreciate it. I will begin by saying that I don't sort of quite know what is going on. And until I know for sure what is going on, it's difficult to make an evaluation. I was brought up on poetry, and one of my touchstones of poetry is memorable speech. Can I, after reading the poem, take the poem away and remember poems like I remember lines from T.S. Eliot? I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Chunks of Yeats, Philip Larkin, Wong Pui Nam, Edwin Tambo. I don't find that in the poems of Marilyn Tan or Lun Lo. But maybe I shouldn't be looking for memorable speech. I should be looking for poets who deconstruct language, who try to fashion language in ways that are unfamiliar to me. So like I said, I welcome it, but I don't quite understand what's going on. So I will reserve judgment.
And I do feel the unfamiliarity and alienation is something that many young poets are intending for nowadays. So perhaps it's already succeeded then because you felt alienated by the text. You're saying something about memorable speech, right? I was wondering if, the fact that more poets these days are avoiding the use of rhyme, for example, like that could be, part of the going away from memorable speech to something perhaps more in the moment, or perhaps just to play with language. Yeah.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, playing with language, with visuals, with punctuation, with dashes, with slashes, and so on and so forth. These punctuation marks seems to be an important part of their experimentation, more so than the poets of my generation. We were traditionalists in terms of punctuation marks, using the full stop and the comma, occasionally the semicolon, things like that, So I'd like to see where it will be leading us. I bought a copy of Singapore Poetries yesterday.
Wow.
Yeah, because I wanted to be able to answer your question about Lun Lo, and I read her poems, and I'm not sure that I know where she's coming from. I read Marilyn Tan's Gaze Back, right?
Yeah.
And she's talking about her writing as being transgenre. I suppose that means that it's a mix of prose and poetry and visuals. So it looks like she's using more of the resources of language than a traditional poet would do, right? So there's something to be welcome, but for me, what is important is understanding first. I don't understand what's going on actually, but perhaps maybe I'm looking at the wrong thing. Maybe understanding is not the first thing I should worry about. Huh? Daryl, what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, on some level, it's funny we are talking about this because I was talking to the artist Bodhi Wijaja just now. We were having lunch, and in some ways we were talking about how he views poems as objects, in some ways as artworks, as artifacts. And maybe that's the other paradigm that is not understanding, because when you approach a piece of art, you don't necessarily seek to understand it, right?
Yeah.
You kind of also seek to just look at its effect and in some ways take in how it makes you feel and how it looks. So I think that those are two ways of looking at poems, and they don't necessarily compete or are opposed, or one is wrong or one is right. It's kind of two ways of looking at a poem,
Yeah, it's just coming from two different places. And I think also I think technological advancements have really shaped this a lot, because we went from just writing on pen and paper to now being able to type things out, and now we can shape our poems, etc. And I guess that introduces that visual element to poems, to poetry now.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, I think so. Technological developments is certainly a part of.
Although I should say maybe that just at this point, I think what you've said so far, Robert, makes you feel a bit more of sound a bit too traditional. But actually, you were a big advocate for Grace Char's shape poems when they first came out, and you found them very refreshing. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
But hers was quite simply what do you call them? What do you call those poems?
Shape poems.
Shape poems.
Yeah. Those were in Wumango.
Yeah. I like them. I'm able to. I dig what she's doing.
Would you do one yourself?
Yeah, I'd like to be able to do one. I don't believe I've done one. Yes, but yes, shape poems. Yeah, concrete poems. Yeah. It's called concrete poems.
Concrete
right?
poems.
Yeah, concrete poems. Right. Yeah, sure. I like Grace Chia's concrete poems actually. Yeah.
Are there any just on a side note, are there any other new poetry forms that you are drawn to? For example, like twin cinema, or is the
yes,
ABC Darien?
Yes.
Yeah.
Something that's supposed to be Singapore born.
Yes.
Who's supposed to?
So the twin cinema was in some ways derived from something that Yao Kai Chai did. So he sort of came up with the form, and others have built upon it.
I'm not sure that I know how to read. I tried reading some of the poems, and it didn't chime with me. But maybe I'm looking for the wrong things in poetry. I don't know. I'm prepared to discard my traditional ways of looking at poetry in order to see if I can get into the new poets. It's one reason why I bought Singapore Poetries. And I welcome the new, although at the moment, audiences looking at Picasso for the first time, wondering what the hell is going on, Well, Picasso, I suppose, imbibed psychoanalysis and so on and so forth. So I suppose the new poets are imbibing technological advancement to write their poems.
I guess we'll move on to the final section, huh? Which I think is more chill. So, looking back on your long life and career, what would you say are the most memorable moments? Or what are you the proudest of?
I would say the discovery of my lost manuscript, Are You There, Singapore? Because if G.G. Thompson had not written the manuscript to me, I would not have had a career as a playwright. And the success of the play in 1974 is something I'm always very proud of, because it was a box office hit. And Corrie Tan has installed it as part of her list of canonical plays. And the other thing that I guess I'm proud of is winning the Southeast Asian Writer Award. I've been not lucky in the sense that I have not won any awards in a long life of writing. Book Development Council Awards, I have not won anything. I've also done some editing, which could have won awards. I think my editing of Singapore short stories in 1978 was a good piece of editing. But a lot depends on judges, right? Whether they like you or not. It didn't bother me that I didn't win awards, although it did contribute to a kind of poetic block, because after 1976 or 77, when I published and Nepal Does Not Help, I did not write poetry for about a decade or so. And my next book of poems was published years after Nepal. So I turned to some other genre. Poetry is not bringing me luck, write something else, kind of thing. You're right in saying that plays are a little more difficult to write because they have a performative aspect. You have not only to write a play, but you have to ask yourself, can this be performed? That makes playwriting a little more difficult. And during the period that I was active, a little more dangerous. When my play, 1 Year Back Home, was about to be performed, I had to appeal to the permanent secretary for permission to have the play licensed. And the play was licensed because the person who actually finally approved of the play 1 Year Back Home, 1980, was none other than the acting Minister for Culture, Ong Teng Cheong, who later became president. Ong Teng Cheong is widely known as a man of the arts, but he's the one who said okay to 1 Year Back Home.
What advice would you give to aspiring writers or young writers now?
I would say be interested, write what you love, don't let anybody provide you with an agenda. And secondly, if you have the stamina, persist in writing. Don't be a one-book person. Go on writing and writing. Be sustained, be persistent, if you're lucky enough, that is. Don't be disheartened by setbacks, like a bad review, or a license not given.
The last question we have is, what are the favorite texts you have had the chance to read in your lifetime?
Well, that's an impossible question to ask. I will answer your question about some of the favorite writers that I like. Mm-hmm. As for your last question, that's an impossible question. Right? Okay, let me just see. I'll name a few, okay?
Sure.
Out of so many. In poems, I find myself responding to people like Boey Kim Cheng, Joshua Ip, Ko Ji Leong, and Daryl. Okay?
Thank you.
In fiction, there's Ovidia Yu and Mira Chan. I recently read Mira Chan's Sacred Waters, about women who fought for Indian independence under Subhash Chandra Bose.
Yes, the Indian Independence Army. Yeah. Pioneer.
And in theatre, I say Harish Sharma and Alfian Saad. I don't follow the theatre as much as I used to. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does.
Absolutely, yeah. Are there particular ones you, outside of Singapore though, that you go back to? Are there particular writers that you go back to?
I'm always reading new stuff. I find if it, I don't usually go back to a writer because there's so much to read. I just finished reading Ulysses.
Oh.
It's taken me about 15 years.
Wow, that means
Difficult.
It's not an easy read, yeah.
Not easy to read. So I'm now trying to reread Ulysses with some guidance from critics. I think all this thing about the framework of the Homeric epic is something that you can probably brush aside, because if you're looking for parallels, it's difficult to find parallels. So just enjoy the book for what it is and forget about the parallels. But I read all kinds of things. I just finished reading Sacred Waters by Meera Chand. Before that, I read a fluffy thing that Ovidia Yu writes. It's interesting that she can write about these detectives, anti-Lee detective in Singapore, and find international publishers. You know what I mean? William Morrow, part of HarperCollins, and there are some of our poets who are published by major presses like Kakanet, who publishes Ji Leong and Teo Kwek, right? People like that. So I think Singapore writing is really rising, in my view. In other words, Singapore writers are not just satisfied with local reputations, they're looking abroad. And I must say that a trailblazer is somebody I've not talked about is Catherine Lim. She was published internationally many years ago. What I lamented some time ago to Joshua Abe was the lack of criticism in our culture. I think Catherine Lim deserves a book to herself. Nobody has written about it. I think the English department of NUS is not playing its part. There was a time when the NUS was very supportive of Singapore writing. The English department is not anymore.
Yeah. It seems in many ways the department in NTU is actually blazing ahead.
Yeah.
In this regard.
So let me start again. When Edwin Tambu and Ban Kachun and people like that, when Tambu was the dean, Ban Kachun was the head of department, they were pro Singapore writing. You know, look at what's happened now. The only person, I suppose, who does Singapore writing will be Robin Loon, who teaches theatre, including local theatre. I don't know about Chitra. Chitra Sankaran wrote with Keika Seed an appreciative essay on my plays. I don't know what's happened to it. Ismail Tanim has left. He was a Singapore lit stalwart. Who else is there? It's ironic that when Singapore lit is rising and some of Singapore writers are achieving international fame abroad, that they should be neglected by the NUS. Most of them are graduates. Most of the Singapore writers are NUS graduates of the English department. Not necessarily in English, but most of them are. Tambu, Arthur Yap, Lee Su Peng, Joshua Ip, and so on and so forth. Myself, all graduates of the English department. What is it doing? Sad.
What hopes do you have for Singlet and yourself?
I hope to see a Singaporean writer win a major literary prize and establish Singapore as having something to offer. You see the latest interview with Ong Keng Sen. His Trojan Woman is going to premiere in the Edinburgh Arts Festival. He says when you mention Singapore, people ask, what is it known for in the arts? And he says, isn't it time we had a national theatre? So I think we need a writer who perhaps can win a major international prize, like the Booker. Then people will be able to take note and say, Singapore, I know so-and-so who won the Booker Prize. Otherwise, what is Singapore known for? Our plays have traveled internationally, but people abroad have short memories. Our plays have been to Cairo, to Taiwan, to Edinburgh. Emily was in Edinburgh, to Washington, to Australia, to New Zealand. But people have short memories. What is Singapore known artistically for? You tell me. But also because there's lack of criticism. Catherine Lim deserves to be better known than she is. But people don't write about her. There was a time when I was traveling in Europe and you would be able to see her books in airport bookshops. What's happened to her? There isn't a single book on her. And she's published close to 20 or more books.
Was that the uplifting ending?
No, that was better than the previous one.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add since you've prepared so much? Any last thoughts?
Now I'm trying to write a 4th play.
Oh.
Wow.
And if I do it, it will be called the Singapore Quartet. I had created a character in Are You There Singapore, whose name I forget. I'm sorry. He had made himself well known by making anti-Vietnam speeches in Trafalgar Square. But he was on PSC scholarship. And not supposed to do that. So I want to write a play partly about bond breaking, or how he gets reprimanded by the PSC for making anti-Vietnam speeches in Trafalgar Square when he was on PSC scholarship. And I also want to do something, part of my play. There is in the Singapore trilogy, the heroine Hoa, who remains an unmarried mother and comes back with a daughter. Years later, the father returns to find out what has happened to his illegitimate daughter. So I'm trying to bring the two elements together. One, because the character that I wrote about, I abandoned him after the first play. I didn't know what to do with him because other characters sort of took the front stage. And I thought, well, I'll do something about it. So I'm started on that play. I haven't continued.
Well, I think that's all. Thank you so much for being here with us, Robert and Daryl.
Thanks so much, Robert.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks,
it was
Hao
a really great conversation. I learned a lot. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed listening. If you did, please share the episode with your friends and on social media. Thank you and have a nice day. Bye-bye.